Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to this first 1 in 4 webinar on the theme of overcoming barriers. We work with adult survivors of child sexual abuse, and in this series, we're aiming to explore the various barriers that people encounter as they go about their journey to recovery. The seminar is going to last for 30 minutes and there'll be some time before the end for questions and comments, and you can use the Q&A or the chat button to submit any questions or observations that you may have. Today we're talking about the barriers that people face, that adult survivors face, as they access and engage with psychotherapy. And I'm delighted to introduce Julie Browne, who's our clinical director. And Julie heads up a team of 6 psychotherapists and 3 interns delivering a psychotherapy service to the men and women who engage with 1 in 4. So you're very welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
So just to start, Julie, I mean, as our name says, 1 in 4 adult or 1 in 4 Irish people have experienced sexual violence before the age of 18. And we know, even though we're very busy at 1 in 4 and have long waiting lists, that a lot of people never reach out for help or support. So from your experience, what are the barriers and the challenges people face as they maybe think about reaching out and engaging in therapy?
So I suppose just in preparation for this conversation, I asked a number of my clients and I asked the team, and they asked some of their clients. And I suppose the first thing to say is there was no shortage of the barriers tripped off people's tongues. You know, there were many. And I suppose for the purposes of today, I want to hone in on just 2 or 3. And the first one is shame. And very particularly, I think we all know what it's like to feel ashamed. And really when you feel ashamed, you want to sort of hide and disappear and run away. So if there's a sort of a real fear of exposure that comes with shame. And I think that really mitigates against people being able to come forward. And just in one, it's almost like a lot of the fear, I think, that attaches, the terror that attaches to the abuse nearly becomes connected to the fear of exposure. So nearly the fear of exposure becomes the biggest thing. And, I've many examples of that, but within one particularly marked example of a client that I have, and he's a beautiful, gentle man. And he described a particularly brutal assault, more than one perpetrator, were elements of torture, and he really did fear for his life. But he described, while in the main fearing for his life, the other fear he was aware of is that somebody would come and they would be exposed. So it's like in the trauma, it's like he almost felt as, just terrified to keep the secret. So it's a huge internal barrier to overcome, to be able to find the words. And then, so I think shame is and that fear of exposure that comes from shame. And whether or not anyone's had trauma, I think we can all somewhat identify with the feeling of shame, and you don't want to put your head up and kind of name this really scary thing. And I think allied to that a little bit then is a misunderstanding around the fight, flight, freeze response. And I think, I suppose I was conscious there was an article recently, well, within the last, I suppose, maybe 5-6 weeks. It was an article by Una Mullally, I think, and she interviewed a rape victim called Sarah Grace, who is a solicitor, and she spoke about somebody came in her window and she woke up to being essentially choked. And the article was really about the difficulties that witness complainants experience in the criminal justice system. But what was interesting was a couple of my clients referenced it to me, and what they spoke about was how hard she fought. And that was really, they said she fought, she bit, she kicked, she screamed, eventually she escaped, and not until after she'd been badly hurt. And I think even survivors themselves, I suppose all of us, we like to think we'd like to fight or run. And really the freeze response is the one that kicks in when that fight or flight just isn't available. And it's a massive amount of energy that goes into shutting the body down in order really to protect it. But I think the other complicating factor is that often perpetrators in their cognitive distortions or choose to believe maybe that freeze and somehow is consent. you know, because if the child isn't struggling or isn't screaming or isn't, you know, so I think it becomes very, very confused. And again, around, I suppose, the community, this community understanding of trauma. So I suppose the three things are linked: the shame, and then the misunderstanding of how children react, how bodies react in trauma situation, particularly in complex trauma where it's repeated again and again, and abuse is maybe occurs over many years. And is the re-victimization then that can occur. So again, a client gave me permission to share this, that when she was very young, probably not yet started primary school, she was abused quite seriously by an extended family member for a couple of years, and the abuse at that point stopped. And she then, in her very late teens, was raped a number of times by the same, a different person, but was raped a number of times by a perpetrator, the same one. And many years later, she found herself in a psychiatric hospital, partly as a result of the trauma that she'd endured. And she was having a conversation with another patient on the ward. I suppose very much about like what's happened in your life that you've ended up here. And, you know, she said, oh, like things that happened to my childhood. And, you know, she said that she said about what happened when she was very small. And then she told the person then about the later assaults. And he said, how could you be that unlucky? And, you know, there's something about that response that just, I suppose what it becomes internalized is that it's the part, again, it's the victim's fault, because it's not unlucky. It's you know, it's that conditioning, it's the, you know, your sense of self having been eroded, you've been conditioned to keep quiet, to kind of keep the peace, to the fear of exposure. So I think it's so important when people find a voice to be able to disclose. I think we all have a responsibility as much as we can to hear and to not, I suppose, not to compound the harm.
Okay, and I mean, as we know, a lot of our clients who are abused in childhood have a vulnerability to further abuse in adulthood. Just moving on, Julie, I mean, you've named some of the big barriers, and of course the other barrier is that when people actually do reach out, they very often find themselves on a waiting list, not just in 1 in 4, but across all the rape crisis centres and so on, because our resources are so limited. But once somebody does engage in therapy, once somebody comes into 1 in 4 and meets a psychotherapist and starts off on that journey, what are the challenges, the big challenges that clients actually meet? And maybe what are their fears about that particular process?
Well, I think actually one of the biggest barriers is like crossing the door, because literally just by, I suppose, initially lifting the phone and then, you know, finding themselves standing outside our door, if they are sort of acknowledging in quite a kind of, I suppose, concrete way that they've been a victim of child sexual abuse. And so that everyone says it's like crossing a threshold in many, many ways. And I suppose what maybe a misconception or a worry is for people is that they're going to have to come in and recount all of this kind of gory details of what's happened to them. And really, usually, I mean, obviously everybody's individual and we meet people very much as individuals. But often really what they're struggling with is quite intense PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, not sleeping, not eating, you know, really kind of like physical symptoms of jumping in the room, really high vigilance. So a lot of the early work is really about that kind of containing and finding tools to manage the trauma, grounding, all of that. And it's much later really when we have done that and the person is equipped to manage when the kind of, for example, the flashbacks come, that then we move back into actually exploring maybe in much more subtle ways the impacts that the abuse has had on them. And I think part of that is many people can speak not without difficulty or a lot of pain or a lot of unease, but they can speak about maybe the physical, sexual things that happened. And that's what they sort of identify. But I suppose what we know from all we've learned from victim survivors and what we know from our work with perpetrators as well is that actually the abuse occurs or begins at a very different point in time with a sort of a grooming process, manipulation process, and really by the time the first time the sexual act happens, that child is so much under the control of that perpetrator, and they haven't even realized, you know, because it's like there's a map being followed, but they're not even aware that it exists. So they're not, you know, because I mean, if you think about children generally, like I think, and maybe this is my attitude as a parent, but I don't think children are that easy to control. to get them out to school with their shoes and it's not an easy task. So the power that a perpetrator has to know that that they can so intrude upon a child, and that child is not going to scream or tell, that power is well established often. And it's like what we spend a lot of time doing is tracing back with people so we can see the really subtle manipulations and sort of start to kind of unravel them and really kind of get themselves back.
Julie, I'm often asked, given that we've waiting lists, why don't we cut down the time in therapy? And I mean, typically our clients would be with us 2 to 3 years, some even longer, some shorter, of course. And why don't we offer a more short-term focused therapy? So for clients like ours with complex trauma, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose first of all, it's to say that in principle, of course, I'm so aware of the people on the waiting list, and if I'm not averse to efficiency in any way, but it's also important to note that short-term therapies are the empirical basis for them is that they attend to the symptoms, and it's management of symptoms, and there's a huge place for that, and that's an important aspect. But I think when you look at what has been taken away from victims, like their whole adolescence, sometimes their whole childhood, trust in relationships, attachment to parental figures, I think they deserve better and more than managing their system, managing the symptom, even though that's really important. And, so we're often our average client in therapy with us 2 to 3 years, but in that time they make very profound changes. It's a very in-depth kind of process, and they make quite profound changes in many areas of their life and go on to live very, very differently. They may still always fall back on some of the tools that they learn. As I said, tools are useful, but I don't think they're enough, and I think we need to do better than that.
And I mean, sometimes clients will check back in years later. And what's our experience of that?
Well, I always say, and I think maybe other therapists say as well, that it's a daunting thing for someone to leave therapy, but it's obviously like a success when they leave, especially when it's not a time limited program and the things have been processed and worked through. And what I have found in my experience, and I think this is echoed by others in the team, that people will ring back, it could be a year or two later, and say, some sort of crisis. We'd always fit them in when someone is on holiday or, you've got a cancellation, and usually they sit down and within 1 or 2 sessions, they're like, no, I'm actually fine. And it's just like reminding them. And it's almost like, and I think I suppose the evidence would marry this in terms of more in-depth therapy, is that it's like the effects being maintained over time. And oftentimes for those short-term therapies, the effects are maintained but dwindle, certainly over years and certainly over a lifetime. Whereas with the in-depth therapy, the evidence would show that not only is it maintained, but it is increased, and people kind of have internalized some sort of capacities, and they go and deepen that themselves, and again maybe live quite different lives, have more successful relationships, and relationships that are unhealthy. So yes, on the surface of it, it's a very different model, and it's costly in ways, but it is achieving and aiming to do something quite different.
Of course, that holds great hope for survivors out there who may be suffering at the moment the very long-term impacts of child sexual abuse. I'm just conscious of time, Julie, so I just want to finish up by maybe focusing on the therapist, because working in this area, it's often very painful, very challenging, very distressing material, and of course you form a very strong relationship with your client. So, I mean, from your point of view, what are the sort of impacts that has on your life?
Well, I suppose one of the things is, and it was more live when my children were younger, but, that sense that the world isn't a safe place. And, I can remember like the first invites to play dates, and, it was like someone was asking me, could I have a kidney? It was like, can I have my child for 2 hours? And over time, in terms of going to pick up the children, realize they're alive and unscathed, and probably the parents that had them were like shattered after making such a big effort. And I started to think, like, what is wrong with me? Like, these people are creating this really lovely invitations, and I'm having this other response. And what I came to, or how I deal with it, is I sort of think, I suppose from learning as well, oftentimes abuse that occurs can only occur repeatedly and over a prolonged period if the attachment, if there's some sort of breach in attachment in a child's life, or maybe because there are other difficulties in the family, with addiction or, you know, some sort of absences. So I thought, like, if you're attuned to your children, as much as, you know, not ideally, or I'm by no means an ideal parent, but it's somewhat attuned and you notice differences in them. So I suppose who I trust is them, you know. I suppose that's an impact on me. I don't find, I have to be honest and say, I don't find the trauma itself that difficult. And I can only say that, I suppose an example that came to mind when I was thinking of this conversation was, very recently, in the last few weeks, a client, I suppose, described quite a difficult abuse experience that she went through. And she said, this isn't the exact sentence, but it was something along the lines like, I feel disgusting. And I don't know how you do this all the time. And in the moment, and I was thinking, you know, I suppose what I hear is not, I suppose what I'm listening to and what I hear is not just the what happens, which often is very distressing and disturbing. But what I hear and what I see is this, like, incredible, and this person, she's incredible, bright, funny, beautiful. And I hear her. And I think that kind of brings a resilience and a hope. And I think a lot of people who particularly work in 1 in 4, they would always just hear the person. And I think if you find yourself always hearing just the trauma, that could, you know, lead to, you know, quite serious, actually, mental health effects, maybe for therapists, like vicarious trauma and burnout. And so, yeah, I think it's something about an outlook and being personally resilient. I think that's important as well to work in sexual violence. So for anybody watching who might be interested in working in the field of sexual violence, sexual abuse, I mean, you know, what does a psychotherapist need to get into this work? I think they need to be, as a personally resilient, that, you know, and to be able to, I suppose, contain a lot of disturbing material, have quite a depth of self-reflection where they can notice if that's been activated in their personal life and kind of work through it in supervision or maybe return to therapy for time. I think also it's really important to be able to allow yourself to be vulnerable and, you know, avail of the supports of team members. And I think that's vital. I think, you know, and to make mistakes and to be, I think, probably compassion, resilience and hope are the 3 things I'd say that would be most supportive. Okay, so before we finish, is there any, excuse me, last thing you'd like to say? I suppose, to be honest, I wasn't 100% looking forward to this. I was a bit nervous about it, but then I was thinking it's quite privileged to have a platform to say something. And what I'd like to say, I suppose, to anybody who a victim discloses to, in all the years I've been doing this, no one has ever complained about someone saying to them, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. And all of the, you know, complaints and things come from where people either minimize the harm or kind of maybe, so it's okay just to be there and listen and to not know what to say. And one very final thing I want to say is that the polarizing effects that can come from sexual abuse, and I think we've seen that recently again in the media around this Dingle case, you know, where the people sent the references for the convicted rapist, and because we see that echoed in families all the time where there's a split and people support one or the other. And what I'd say is it's, you know, a mother, of course, or mother of parents whose perhaps son has abused their daughter, they don't necessarily or can't or shouldn't stop loving that son. And it is possible not to turn your back on the person who has committed a sexual offence. And from a recidivism point of view, it's important not to do that. But it is important not to turn your back on truth in doing that, and not to minimize or not to kind of, you know, try or blame the victim. I think there has to be a real kind of, and some very exceptional families do achieve that. And we support people to try to do that then who come in for support here as well. And I mean, that might be a conversation for another day, Julie, the work we do with families and what happens within families where there is abuse. But I'd just like to thank you very much. I think that's, you know, been really interesting, some of the reflections you've made there. So I'm going to invite Kerry, one of our staff, to join us. And Kerry is been monitoring the questions or comments that come in. So she will now put the questions, and either Julie and I will attempt to answer them. So Kerry, if you'd like to make yourself seen. Here she comes.
Hello.
Hi, Kerry. Hi.
Hi. So I just invite anyone who has any more questions to put it into the chat box or the Q&A, and I'll pose it to Maeve and Julie. But one of the reflections that have, or the observations that have come in here is about resourcing, and they were just asking in terms of, for people who aren't able to get onto a wait list, what are some alternative options if people are struggling?
Well, maybe I'll answer that. I mean, the obvious answer is we need more resources, and we are very grateful to the HSE and to TUSLA and to the Department of Justice for the funding they do supply, but it is inadequate, and that's the reality. I mean, there are helplines available to people who are waiting to even get on a waiting list. So, for example, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre runs a national 24-hour helpline where there is support there. We're just about to recruit a waiting list case manager, thanks to funding from TUSLA, who will be available to support people who are on our waiting list through crisis intervention, regular contact support, and so on. But it is a very sad reality that there are people out there who literally can't get on a waiting list at the moment, and COVID has absolutely exacerbated that situation, and that is the sad reality. But I would suggest to people they use the helplines that are out there, including, I should also mention, the Samaritans, who are available 24/7 as well, and that really is the option that's available to people.
And another one that's here is, if just to get your thoughts on there, you had mentioned shame earlier as one of the big barriers to accessing or to coming forward to ask for therapy and help. And someone was asking here about not just shame, but fear of any kind of consequences or safety. So if one of you just want to take that.
Julie, maybe you should take that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there was a huge list of barriers and fear, and for some people that is, you know, it's terror. It's like the terror. And I think maybe to say about PTSD is that if that feels, that level of terror is it's as if it's now. So it's not remembering back to something that's happened. So people are living with that degree of fear before they start therapy or have access to services in a live way. And we've often become quite accustomed to almost this constant gnawing agitation and heart racing, and that's become normal for them. And anything that's related to the abuse, even like going to the cinema and there being like an ad for something, can just trigger that response. So fear can be a very internal process anyway. And then for many clients, especially those who perhaps have been abused, which is, you know, sadly, the main location of abuse now is in families. There's a real fear, like, and sometimes well-founded fear of the family's response, of the community's response, of perhaps being attacked, of being humiliated, of being the family splitting, of hurting people's feelings. I mean, I think fear is very big. And it's really, and oftentimes that fear of, not the trauma fear, but the one about upsetting people, that's part of what has happened in the abuse, where their sense of self has been so eroded that everybody else matters more. And, you know, and part of therapy is helping them see actually you're not responsible for other people's feelings, and, you know, they have rights and it's okay to come forward. And I suppose it can be fears about reporting as well, or those sort of practical things, which is a different conversation that I know Judge Kenny is going to have on another Zoom conversation in series.
Thanks, Julie. Any other questions, Kerry?
Yeah, just a last question here. For someone who is struggling, someone who is a survivor of sexual violence or abuse, what is the best way to help that person's family or friends understand better what they might be going through and how it could affect their mental state and daily challenges?
Okay, Julie, I'll hand that to you again.
So, I mean, again, that's why we have a family program. Sometimes, you know, I suppose there's an expectation that for people that they should be better than they are. And I think that's really difficult for survivors, because that, you know, sometimes literally just to put their feet on the floor, into their slippers and get out of bed is a momentous thing. It takes so much energy to hold down the trauma and manage those symptoms, that just to sort of struggle through the day is a huge success. So I think it's perhaps about, you know, making people aware of what's a fair expectation. And it's often survivors themselves have the most demanding and unfair expectations. but sometimes families too. And it's often, you know, maybe a lot of people who have siblings maybe who are doing really well and lots of in their careers, and then you've got this sort of almost like the person feeling like the odd one out because they are just about getting through each day. And I think it's about being realistic about the potential lifelong impacts of child sexual abuse. And in saying that, I don't want to be, you know, not give hope as well, because they're definitely, it is possible to work through them and process them, but it takes a lot of work, a lot of energy. And sometimes that is someone's job. That's what they're doing. And if they're managing and they're alive and, you know, they're doing well. And it's maybe that families can understand that. And I think sometimes families as well, if there's a lot of shame in the family, if the abuse has happened, and in their defensiveness, it's almost like, again, the victim inadvertently gets blamed, because what's being reflected back is that this child or now adult is really struggling, and what the parents are feeling is, oh, I should have done so. You know, what they're feeling is their own shame and discomfort, and we're very kind of gentle with that here. But then that becomes kind of transferred back into the victim to just do better, because we just don't want to be faced with this anymore.
Okay, we have time for just one more question.
We actually, if anyone has any more questions, you can send them through for one last question, but just a few comments here, you know, saying that this is a really well thought out platform and people appreciate this space. So just to say to everyone here that we have some future webinars coming up as well. Yeah. So.
And I just see one question there in relation to mandatory reporting, but we will have a webinar, it's our very last one towards the end of May, with Dr. Joe Mooney of UCD, who's actually also on our board, but who specialises in child protection, and we'll be dealing with the whole issue of mandatory reporting with them. So look, we're coming to the end of our time, and so I'd just like to thank Julie very much. I'd like to thank everybody who has participated today. This webinar has been recorded and it'll be on our website, so if you have friends or colleagues who might be interested, they can always watch it there. Our next webinar is actually just next week, when I'll be talking to Felicity Kennedy, who is a psychotherapist specialising in the field of trauma. Felicity is also a board member of 1 and 4, and that will be at 12:30 on Thursday. And then the other 2 seminars will follow on 2 weeks later, and then 2 weeks later, finishing at the end of May. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your lunch break.
Bye, everyone.